welcome to Slavery and Its Legacies, a podcast of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Slavery and Its Legacies interviews visiting scholars, activists, and others about their contributions to the understanding of slavery, past and present, and its ongoing role in the development of the modern world.
Hello, this is Thurston, and today I'm speaking with Janice Williams, who is a recent PhD graduate from Vanderbilt University and now is at the Stanford Humanities Center, where she's their Mellon postdoctoral fellow. She's here for the month working on what is to become her book, tentatively titled Race, Place, and Expertise, working in the St. Vincent Botanic Garden, 1765 to 1822. It's really great having you here.
Thank you for having me.
So, how did you? This is like a pretty specific kind of historical field of gardens and that sort of thing. There's been a lot of new work done on it seems. And how did you come by the field originally?
Well, I'd always had an interest in plants, and in graduate school, in speaking with my graduate advisor, he suggested I consider an imperial project. And so, as you mentioned, I've came across some of the recent work that's been done. One of these books is Richard Drayton, Nature's Government, where it talks about the way botany sort of grew in tandem with empire. And in his book, it really focuses more on the British Empire and the role of Kew Gardens in London. And the way that, Kew and people at Kew tended to support botanical workers throughout the empire to find plants and exchange them between the various colonies for the benefit of empire. So, obviously plants are big business.
Right.
They can really mean the difference between success or failure when it comes to an imperial venture. And I thought, well, we have this great story about what's happening in an empire-wide sense, but what if we really zero in to the botanical gardens that are in the colonies and look at the naturalists working in the colonies and see how they're relating to local communities and fitting in with local government?
Right, and so your book, you're kind of focused on St. Vincent for the time that you've been here, but your book covers a couple of other sites. There's one in India, is that right?
That's right, yes. There's the Calcutta Botanic Garden in India, which ends up being sort of the head of a network of gardens there. There's also a botanic garden in Sydney, and then, of course, there are a few in the Caribbean that I look at. These are all founded in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And
St. Vincent, could you say a little about St. Vincent? It's small, I believe.
Yes. The garden there was actually founded very shortly after it was ceded to the British. It was after the 7 Years' War in 1763. St. Vincent becomes a British colony. And at that time, it was not terribly well populated. There were a few French settlers there with smaller estates, and then there were a lot of indigenous people on the island that lived in the interior. And so once this island was ceded to the British, there was the question of how to develop this. What sort of economy did they want this garden, this island to have? Would it become like the other sugar colonies that Britain already had, or would they grow other plants? And so a garden being founded there is, helps to answer this question in some ways, or it's placed there to help answer this question.
So it has an economic – the kind of reason for establishing a garden in a place like St. Vincent is for commercial reasons or scientific or –
well, oftentimes they're sort of intertwined, and depending on if you could go back to 1765 when the garden was started, and whoever you talk to would probably have a different idea of the garden's purpose, but – the funding coming from government, it was basically because there's the sense that this garden could help local settlers determine which plants could be profitably grown, help them obtain the actual plants and specimens to grow, and then just give them advice on how to actually successfully rear these plants.
Now, it seemed like a lot of what's happening in the garden has a lot to do with the personality and the circumstances of the man in charge at the time. Could you say a little about that kind of history of just the kind of management of the garden and how that came about? Because it also marks a bit of a transition, it seems.
Yes, it does. A lot of naturalists in that period were, wealthy gentlemen of means, basically, where they could fund their own trips, out to colonies or just out into the world, collect specimens of plants and animals that were unfamiliar to Europeans and bring them back to Europe, and then they would often write up accounts of their journeys. And so this is how they could make their scientific reputation. But for people to try to get people to actually stay in the colonies and work there is sort of a different question. And so these gardens opened up an opportunity for people that wanted, or men, I should say, that wanted to be naturalists and had some education but didn't have the financial means to fund their own travels. So they would go out in imperial service, sometimes in the military or as a surgeon, and then they would end up staffing these gardens. And so you mentioned sort of what the gardens were for. So if you ask the government, they would definitely be for commercial purposes or trying to develop agriculture. But for the people working in the garden, for these superintendents, they're trying to win a scientific reputation. So they're often pushing the government to focus on projects that might not have a very obvious financial return, or at least not immediately. So this would be, plant exploration. So these men wanted the government to fund them to travel to nearby islands, at least in the Caribbean's case, to find, to explore the area, see what new plants they can find. They want the government to fund botanical drawings to keep a record of the new plants they're finding. And they also want to most of them want to publish. And so they want to have floras, make a flora of the region, because this is how you win a scientific reputation.
Right, and especially for something where a scientist used to kind of come from a gentleman's background. I mean, you had to be wealthy. You had to have a source of income in order to do this kind of work. This is someone who maybe has the talent and the interest, but to kind of come up from, the middle or working classes, if with enough kind of drive and talent, and I suppose also the patronage of the right people.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, even if you were someone with drive and with some knowledge, if you were just someone without a lot of social status, you definitely needed a patron to recognize you. And in that sense, your patron recognizing you, that's what gives you the credibility to then claim that you have this expertise. So you don't get sent to a botanic garden just because you know things. There's really no test for you to take, or there's no credentials really at this time.
Sure.
But if, for instance, Joseph Banks, who is a very important person in British science in the time, if he recognizes your botanical skill, he might be able to pull strings to give you a position like this.
Right. As it happens, I believe he does recognize Alexander Anderson, his skills, who goes on to become the first. What's the term? Administrator or what?
We usually call them superintendent.
Superintendent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Alexander Anderson was actually not the first, but he's the first once the garden is sort of really taken under imperial government's wing. The St. Vincent Garden, when it was first founded in 1765, it was a very local affair where Melville, who was the governor of the region at the time, he tasked a local doctor called George Young to help start up this garden. And so, it was initially just...
So it's just a local kind of endeavor.
Yeah. And at that point, it really depends on the whims of each succeeding governor if they don't feel like supporting it.
Right.
But Melville continued, once he had even been recalled from the island, he continued to try and support the garden from afar, which is why there was actually something in 1785 to then become an imperial garden, which Alexander Anderson takes control of.
Okay, and so tell me a little about his rise, how he, as you said, he's talented, obviously, but it takes more than talent and drive to reach a position like this. How is it that he comes to the attention of Banks?
Yeah, he's sort of an interesting case. He knew that he wanted to study botany, but there really wasn't an avenue for that. So he took a medical course, of course, decided to be a surgeon. And so he went out to the colonies as a surgeon in the military. And when he's serving as a hospital mate in St. Lucia, he actually comes to the attention of Dr. Young, who's the first superintendent of the garden, who happened to be working there as well. And Alexander Anderson finds what he thinks might be a good substitute for, I believe it's called cinchona. I might be mispronouncing that, but it's what's used to make quinine to treat malaria.
Yeah.
So he thinks he finds a tree, that, a bark that can be substituted for this, and he brings it to the attention of Dr. Young, who then already knows of Joseph Banks, and so in that way he comes to the attention of Joseph Banks. And Anderson also, surprisingly, already had some contacts in the region, including the governor of Barbados. So he was really making a name for himself locally as someone who knew about plants. And it's through this recognition, both locally and then, of course, by Joseph Banks, that really puts him first and foremost in everyone's mind when the idea comes to sort of reestablish the St. Vincent Garden on an imperial footing.
So when does he come to the garden?
He comes to the garden in 1785, and this was actually right after a French takeover of the island. So that's why Dr. Young was in St. Lucia as well. So, they sort of leave the island, the French take over, but the plot of land is still there. And, the French were, they were pretty forward-looking when it comes to botanical exploration in their colonies. So if they have this ready-made botanical garden, they're not going to just bulldoze it over, basically. Right. So it exists as an entity still with the plants once the British return in 1785. And at that point, Anderson, he has a little bit of trouble finally taking control over the garden from the governor, but eventually he is able to get reinstated there and start the work of the garden again.
So when he arrives there, what has the economy of St. Vincent become? What are they doing there economically?
Well, by that point, St. Vincent is starting to get onto the path of being a sugar colony.
Sure.
It was seeded back in 1763. It still just had those French smallholders, and there was cocoa and coffee were being grown on the island. So it was actually, not the sort of standard sugar colony that you would expect. But once Anderson gets there, it's really starting to become a planter economy, and they end up being a very powerful local block of people where sometimes, depending on who they were, some of them are supportive of the garden's efforts, but others are not. And really all they want to do is grow sugarcane, and they seem to resent the garden in their midst that might be suggesting
it's on a valuable plot of land?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, there's the sense of, well, we grow sugarcane. That's the crop we need to grow here. Right. There's no point in trying to grow anything else. And, I mean, to be fair to them, that there was some validity to that argument in the sense that with the mercantile structure of the British Empire, there would have had to have been some changes in duties and what have you in order for other industries to grow there. I mean,
right, and that is kind of being part of the empire. That is part of the Botanic Garden's mission is to somehow support, the agricultural economy in some way. I'd imagine it's not to do pure science as much as all scientists wish they could. It's supposed to be applied as something that can be used in the and so what kind of work is Anderson doing at the time? What is happening with the garden?
Well, it ends up being in some of these colonies that the local superintendent ends up being sort of a jack of all trades because he is someone who is trained in some sort of scientific discipline. They're the medical doctor, so and they're the one who knows about plants. So the local government will sometimes go to them with pretty much any sort of problem. And then, of course, they develop their own initiatives. So in St. Vincent, Alexander Anderson was sort of your first method if you wanted to find seeds for, say, upland cotton or something. If you wanted to find a plant that you were not able to get yourself, you might go to the superintendent and assume that he would have networks. He's probably exchanging plants with people all over the world. In theory, he should be able to obtain those seeds for you. And so I have evidence of agricultural societies in the region contacting Alexander Anderson to ask for specific agricultural plants. So that's one thing. The second thing is, he is supposed to also do experiments himself to see what sort of plants can be grown. So there's the question of whether a spice industry can be developed in the Caribbean. So Alexander Anderson is trying to grow cloves and nutmegs and things like that to see, can they work in St. Vincent's climate? Do we think this can be done profitably? And so in that sense, he's going to be an example. Once he's established that, okay, yes, we can grow cloves, he's then supposed to be an example to the actual planters to start growing cloves of, for economic reasons.
Is he going about and trying to explore uses for local flora as well? But finding new plants and finding applications for them. How is he working with kind of indigenous knowledge, I guess, about the island's flora?
Well, I definitely get tantalizing clues, in the archives. I'm mostly dealing with government documents and some personal correspondence, and so you'll see fleeting glimpses here and there of that sort of thing. And so he would push very frequently to go on these plant collecting trips. And in this earlier stage, most of the superintendents would try to find indigenous, cures or see if there's uses for plants. They would record these too. So they might also record indigenous names, local common names, in addition to assigning a scientific name. And so Dr. Young before him, he was actually specifically tasked by Governor Melville, who's really the garden's founder. He was tasked by Melville to go and talk to, everyone, slaves, the Native Americans living there, everyone, just to see if there were any, cures or plants they knew of and to pay for them as well. For Anderson, there's less evidence of that, but I know that he did travel around the island, and future superintendents would question slaves working on the island to see did they know of various cures that were unknown to Europeans.
I see. A lot of the work that you're doing is about how expertise can be employed to change your standing vis-a-vis your class or race. And in Anderson's case, I wonder how that's working, especially with the planters who, if they aren't, I'm sure they're comporting themselves as if they were the lords of all creation. And how did they relate? Do you see a tension between Anderson and the local? I mean, you've mentioned a little, but is there a kind of class-related dimension to it that you can see?
Yes, there definitely is. And the funny thing is that the colonies were often a place where all sorts of people could go and remake themselves. So in theory, it should be more fluid when it comes to class.
Yeah.
But you still get a little bit of tension because with Anderson, he seems to have been a great showman and that he actually did a good job enlisting just local planters. Like, for instance, there was a famous voyage in which breadfruit were brought from Tahiti to the West Indies to provide a sort of emergency nutrition for slaves there. And so when Anderson has reared the first crop of breadfruit, and he's trying to sell this to the planters to grow them, so he actually has a little party at the governor's mansion where they taste the first breadfruit together. So, that's his very, he's really selling this idea to the planters.
Promo.
But he has terrible time with the governor, and I think that's at least the first governor when he first arrives. When he's trying to take control of the garden, as has his orders from London tell him to, the governor resists this, and the governor has his cattle grazing in the garden. He has family living in the superintendent's house in the garden, and I think in that sense, the governor is different. He usually is someone from the upper crust. A lot of them are, part of the peerage. They've been knighted,
right? And
so I think for the governor to have someone like Anderson, who's really has no social status to fall back on, to have someone like Anderson, tell him you need to remove yourself and remove your cattle from this garden, I think it's really a shock. And this is a completely new government post, so it's not like there's respectability built into it.
Right, exactly. I can imagine. Now, let's move on to John Tiley, who's Anderson's assistant. Could you talk a little about him and how he fits into your kind of story?
Well, John Tiley is a man of color who, Anderson is able to. He says he procures him from Antigua. We don't really know. I don't know what that means exactly. But John Tiley was an artist. He was able to. He says he was self-taught, and he was able to make botanical drawings, which are actually very important for people or naturalists working in the empire, because a botanical drawing can record everything about a plant. They can be used as advertisements, send them back home to your patron. Really, it's a record of the sort of work that you're doing that's not as subject to decay as, say, a dried plant or even a living plant might be.
Right.
And So, John Tiley's in this garden, so of course he's a man of color, so he has to deal with extreme limitations placed upon people of his type. But, he has this specialized knowledge. It's rare to have someone with his sorts of talents in the Caribbean. And so really he's able to use that knowledge of his to transcend his class in some ways. Mm-hmm. He because he's a leader in the community for people of color, he ends up being an activist. And in this sense, he runs afoul of the government, who doesn't like the fact that he's advocating for the rights of free people of color. So he ends up losing his job at the Botanical Garden. So really, even though he has this special skill, it's not really enough to totally rewrite what's possible for him as a person of color at that time.
How long does he work at the garden?
Well, he works in the garden for about 10 years.
Do you have any indication of what Anderson thinks of Tiley's activism?
Well, the forms it took, the best that I can tell, because the documents are scarce on this. But we do know that he was in correspondence with free people of color across the Caribbean. So this is probably in Trinidad, Barbados. He's writing to other people, and presumably they're trying to just organize so that they're can be united in their request for normal rights or the rights that people, because a lot of these people of color they have property or they have some education. I think they want to be recognized as British citizens. So I don't really know the content of the letters. When he actually gets warning ahead of time that basically the magistrates or the people are coming for him. They know that he's had this correspondence, and so he's able to destroy a lot of the letters that he had in his possession. So we don't really know exactly, but according to...
Good for him, bad for us.
Yes, exactly. But according to the government, they claim that his writings were abusive to the white populations of the islands and that they were seditious. So he ends up being charged for seditious libel.
So is this happening? How close or on the heels of the Haitian Revolution is this? And is there a kind of does that kind of impact kind of the fears of people? Or?
Oh, definitely. So this is happening in 1800. And,
okay.
And so yes, and so this is definitely all of the revolutions that are happening: the French Revolution, Fedon's Rebellion, everything that's happening in the Caribbean. It's on everyone's mind. And honestly, after he is found to have written these letters, the officials of St. Vincent actually write to the other British possessions to say, look, we've found this correspondence. Please be vigilant in your own colony to see, if there's some sort of plot afoot. So they were really, the government at this time, the colonial government in the Caribbean, they were really just concerned with any type of unrest amongst free people of color or enslaved people as well.
So Tiley leaves St. Vincent?
Yes, he's exiled from St. Vincent. He's sent first to Barbados, where one of his correspondents were presumably to give the magistrates on that island the chance to charge him with something. And he returns to Antigua, where he was from. Does he
have any connections that allow him to continue doing the kind of work that he was doing with Anderson, like artistic renditions of plants, and does he find himself a way back into that profession?
Yes, it seems that he does. This is all circumstantial. I've found bits and pieces here and there, but it does seem that Anderson must have stuck by him through all of this, through his trial and conviction and his return to Antigua, because he is eventually. There's two people in London who want to hire him to be a naturalist to travel to Trinidad to search, for plants there and stay there for 2 years even.
Wow.
And so, of course, he needs a passport to do this, which is why we have record of this. Fortunately, there's, letters back and forth to try to obtain this passport for him. And the people in London had connections to Anderson. It's not, I don't have a letter, that's like a smoking gun saying they wrote to Anderson, but through family members and so on, they are sort of connected in a 2 degrees of separation sort of way to Anderson. So I really think it must have been Anderson that helped line up this opportunity for Tiley. Unfortunately, though, because the people in Trinidad, the governor Picton there, does know about his past as an activist, essentially, and he refuses to let him on the island.
So do you know what becomes of Tiley?
I don't know. There's another wisp, letter from 1815 where someone else living in Antigua, who's a doctor there, writes to Joseph Banks in London to mention Tiley and also send one of Tiley's drawings. So I do know, at least in 1815, to some degree, he's still pursuing botanical drawing, but whether it's his primary means of support or something he does in his spare time, I really don't know. And then the last thing I've really seen of him is that in the 1820s, he signed a petition of free people of color. So which, again, it shows that he continued his sort of activism and was probably seen as a leader in the community in Antigua for free people of color. So he signs this petition to the British government, again, advocating for equal rights.
I've kind of neglected to ask, but do Anderson and Tiley, do they have families who are with them during this time, or are these just solitary men who are doing botanic work?
For Tiley, I don't know. It does seem that he was a solitary man. Anderson does have a family, though. And it's again one of those things where you get these fleeting, tantalizing glimpses where I know that his wife is living with him in the garden, and then occasionally at the end of letters, he writes to his friends in London, and he'll send his regards to their wives, and then the friends will write back and send regards.
Right.
And so I know that they did have a family, and that Tiley would come over after dinner and have a glass of wine occasionally with Anderson and his wife. So that's really all I know about Anderson's family.
And the third person that you look at is an enslaved man named Washington.
Yes, that's
right. And so what is his story like? What's his source of expertise? What do you know about Washington?
It's one of those things where I really just have to guess. I'm not sure exactly what he knows or what his expertise is, but I do know that it was very important to the people around him. The reason I know about him at all is that he was the subject of basically a court, like a legal battle over who owned him. The final superintendent of the St. Vincent Garden purchased him and never sought reimbursement for that purchase from the Crown. So that means that Washington was this final superintendent. But local government, once the superintendent left, they actually ended up closing down the St. Vincent Garden at that time in 1822. And so once this happens, the local government wanted possession of Washington because they were going to continue the garden sort of as an appendage to the governor's mansion, and they wanted him to work there, it seems. And so there was this battle between the two parties. And so I don't really know what Washington knew, but it does seem that his familiarity with the garden was worth enough for the government to go through this trouble to try to get him to stay there and continue the sort of work he was already doing.
I see. And so how is that finally resolved? And how much does he have any? Can you see any that he has any say in this at all? I guess the records, do they show anything like that, or it's hard?
He doesn't seem to have any say, but he surprisingly goes to the governor, because the governor is, the one writing these letters back and forth to government in London to say, okay, well, is he the colonies or not? And so Washington actually, inquires of the governor himself, and the governor listens to him and actually writes in a letter, Washington has been asking me, what's the status of this case? Would you please let me know? And I find that just terribly fascinating. Again, whatever it is that he knows, it must be quite
He's
substantial.
Valued enough that he feels that he can make
an audience with the governor.
Right,
yes.
Exactly.
And so eventually the decision comes down, and it's actually worded in the sense of, you can put Washington's mind to rest that he's the property of Mr. Cayley, who was that last superintendent. So at least from the wording of that, it does seem that Washington may have wanted to be owned by the superintendent. So it's not clear what he thought would happen to him if he were owned by the government instead.
So you say that soon after, around this time, the garden itself it ends up in the hands of the governor?
Yes, it's the governor, the last governor at this time, Charles Brisbane. He had not been a friend to the garden pretty much from the moment he arrived. He recommended that it be closed more than once. He caused trouble for a lot of the superintendents. One of the superintendents, he brought him up on fraud charges. And then for the last superintendent, George Cayley, Cayley had a lot of trouble with local planters. So he's the one where it seems that he just was not able to curry any local favor at all. The planters kept trespassing on the grounds. They'd drive their cattle through the garden grounds. They claimed there was a road through the garden. And so, if Cayley had had the local governor to support him, they could have stopped this trespassing, right? But he just doesn't. Brisbane doesn't do anything and just allows the local planters to just, treat the garden very terribly. And so in this sense, Cayley finds himself friendless. He writes to government in London for help a lot. But obviously they're in London. They can only issue orders, but they can't control what's happening on the ground. And so eventually the garden is, given to the colony in the sense. So the local assembly ends up supporting it for a while. And it's, it seems to run like just like a local park in a sense where you could apply to visit it if you wanted to. But then eventually Brisbane closes it down and starts, keeping anyone from having access to it but himself. And so then at that point, the local assembly declines to continue supporting it themselves because if it's just the private garden of the governor, why should the colony support it?
We can sell it off. Right?
Exactly.
So is there anything that remains of the garden or the grounds now?
Yes, indeed. The good news is that this was government land. It was Crown land. So even though the governor is sort of using it as a private reserve, the land is still set aside, and it remains like that for a while. And the garden actually ends up being restarted in a sense in the 1890s, where again they're trying to find ways to diversify the island economy from sugarcane. And so they end up starting up a lot of gardens throughout the Caribbean, at least the British government does. And so you can actually visit the garden now. It's still on the same plot of land, and it, the website of the garden proudly proclaims its founding in 1765.
Still
it's like
operating.
Yeah, the oldest in the Western Hemisphere. So it's definitely there.
Oh, cool. So I got one other question: is that do you think that the kind of treatment that Cayley received is kind of an indication of kind of how the planters were thinking about kind of claims of expertise in general? Or do you think it was a lot of it just Cayley, and that had it been Anderson in that position, Anderson might have navigated all of that anti-planter sentiment towards him and his work?
That's a great question. I mean, a lot of people have blamed Cayley for this, but I think that it's partly just the difficulty of evaluating expertise in this time that, really – because you don't have, there's not yet a college degree in botany, and even the sense of what a scientist is isn't really hasn't really been solidified. Right. So in this early period, your social status is often what gives you the authority to proclaim your knowledge or expertise on something. And I think Anderson was probably charismatic in a way that Cayley just wasn't, and Anderson was willing to work with the planters and really show off the garden, give them ornamental plants for free, curry favor in a certain way. Right. And so they were willing to go along with Anderson. And, Cayley just wasn't willing to do this. And I think he expected, I have government orders, I have a position, people should respect the orders and the position. But they just didn't, because this is really still a new position, the fact of being a superintendent of a botanic garden. It's not something that's established like, governor or what have you. And there's really just no reason for the planters to respect that on its face.
It's been really fun talking to you. I love this topic, and it's been great having you here. I usually ask before we end things if you have any books that might be of interest to our listeners.
Sure. Well, Richard Drayton's Nature's Government is a good place to start if you're interested in, seeing how botany and empire have been intertwined. And really for me, it was a starting point that made me want to look at, or think about what the local stories were. Mm-hmm. And if you're interested in the idea of the way knowledge from different places might be valued in different ways, you can take a look at Londa Schiebinger's works, Secret Plant Cures of Slaves or Plants and Empire. Both of these are great works that talk about the way people, knowledge, and plants are circulating in the Caribbean, but then also how some of the knowledge might not be valued as much as others because of the source, or it might, not make that transfer from, sort of common knowledge or local knowledge into the scientific record. And then there's a lot of great work these days on go-betweens, which might be the characters like Washington or Tiley, where they're not usually the ones that get credit for scientific work or botanical work, but they're definitely very important in creating that sort of knowledge. And so in that sense, Kapil Raj and Mark Harrison's work are great places to look.
Well, thanks. All of those suggestions will be on the website. And it's been great having you at the center. Sorry to see you go. I hope you've enjoyed New Haven.
I certainly have. Thank you for having me here.
Slavery and Its Legacies is brought to you by the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, a part of the Whitney and Betty McMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale University. Additional support is provided by the Robina Foundation, and production support is provided by the Yale Broadcast Center. For more information about the Gilder Lehrman Center, its activities, and this podcast, visit glc.yale.edu.